Hello and welcome everybody to the new National Trends in Disability Employment, or nTIDE Lunch and Learn series. On the first Friday of every month, corresponding with the Bureau of Labor Statistics Jobs Report, we'll be offering this live broadcast via Zoom webinar to share the results of the latest nTIDE findings. In addition, we will provide news and updates from the field on disability employment, as well as host panelists who will discuss current disability-related findings and events. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. We will post an archive of each of our webinars each month at our website, www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE. This site will also provide copies of the presentations today, the panelist bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources. As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer and no sound is enabled. To ask questions of the panelists, simply click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box. Panelists will review these questions during the assigned question and answer periods.
Hi everybody, this is Andrew Houghtonville from the University of New Hampshire, and I hope you can see me. It says that John O'Neill's box is being shown, but I'll keep going. Welcome to the nTIDE July version using June data. The nTIDE is a monthly lunch and learn that occurs on noon Eastern, so we do this every month on the first Friday. It's a joint effort of the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability, Kessler Foundation, and the Association of University Centers on Disability. We are funded by NIDE, the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research, and it's part of our Employment Policy Center. Today's webcast will be in three basic parts, as we've been doing for a while now. John O'Neill and I will present the monthly report, the monthly findings that were released this morning by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Part two is Denise Roselle from AUCD, who will talk about the news, latest news on employment and disability policy and things going on. And she will have a guest, Ben Trockman from Old National Bank as opposed to New National Bank. Old National Bank. All right. And our guest speaker is Wendy Parent-Johnson from the University of South Dakota Center on Disability. As we've been doing in season 2 of nTIDE, we're going to be holding the questions until the end. And so if you have questions about the statistics, you can wait until the end, or if you have questions about Denise's news or you have questions for Ben, you can ask them at the end in no particular order. Also, we have a Q&A button, and we do try to answer Q&A questions at the bottom or wherever your bar is for the Zoom meeting. You can ask questions beforehand, and sometimes we are able to answer them. Sometimes we have to wait to the Q&A session to answer them. So feel free to put that in there, and I will ask those. What you need to do is just enter the questions in, and I'll read them to Denise and Ben and Wendy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John O'Neill at Kessler Foundation in New Jersey. John?
Good day, everybody. I'm going to describe the nTIDE report, and then Andrew's going to give us the numbers. Andrew, next slide.
I'm trying. There you go.
One back.
Ah, there you go.
Okay. The nTIDE report is a monthly report, and with a press release and an infographic, and it looks at the latest employment statistics, which include the workforce participation rate as well as the employment to population ratio. We use data from the jobs report, otherwise also known as the employment situation report, that's released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics on the first Friday of each month. The nTIDE report is a joint effort between the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire. And we have been conducting this nTIDE report since 2013 on a monthly basis. Next slide, Andrew. The source of the data, as I had said before, it's the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's the survey that they call the Current Population Survey, or the CPS, and it is the source of the official unemployment rate. And it includes civilians, working age civilians, age 16 to 64, not living in institutions. This information has been available, or this since 2008, and it's really the result of the 6 disability questions being added to census data, which included the BLS Current Population Survey at that time. The data is not yet seasonally adjusted, which is why we compare to the same month last year. We are working on the seasonal adjustment, and we're hoping to have something, have a report out sometime this fall that will include the seasonally adjusted information. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Andrew, and you can report on the numbers.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, we'll get that seasonal adjustment done soon. It's something we keep pecking away at. We want to make sure we get it right, though, and you know, we're right at the time when we have a long enough time, enough months to start doing it, enough years to start doing seasonal adjustments. So we're right on the edge of that having sufficient amount of data. So the numbers, it was a good month. The employment to population ratio went up from 28.1% last year in June to 29.8% in June of 2017, so last month. That's up 6%, or 1.7 percentage points. For people without disabilities, it also went up, although slightly, from 73.2% to 73.9%, only a 1% increase, or a 0.7 point increase. And this is very similar to last month, if you remember from last month. And in fact, this is similar to the last 15 months. We've seen improvements for people with disabilities that are greater than the improvements for people without disabilities. And I'll provide that chart that we always talk about that will show that point. The labor force participation rate, so this includes not only people who are working, but people who are actively looking for work. So this is the percentage of people who are considered in the labor force, as opposed to being out of labor force where you're not looking for work in the last, actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, and you're not working. So the labor force participation rate increased from 32.1% to 33%. That's up 2.8%, or almost a full percentage point. For people without disabilities, it went up from 76.9% to 77.3%. So up about 0.5%, or about a 0.5 percentage point too. And so again, for labor force participation rate, it didn't go up quite as dramatically as the employment to population ratio. In part, that might be a function of in some places in the country, the labor market is quite tight, or people are just jumping straight into work. They're not going through a long period of search. It's hard to compare the two numbers and then compare changes. I know certainly in New England there are many jobs available, although I'm not sure how good those jobs are. Certainly I see a lot of help wanted signs around New Hampshire. In terms of the long-term prospect, so this is the graph we look at every year. The June months are highlighted with the bigger dots and squares, and what you see is you know, the beginning this data only starts at the just after the Great Recession hit. So the first year, the first month is October 2008, and October 2008, and that's when the first official data started to be released. And so you see a continuation of the Great Recession. And for those not familiar with recessions, they're typically employment lags behind, that economic growth declines, and then people are laid off a few months or a few quarters after the decline in economic growth in GDP. But what we see is, and I'll go to the next one, what we see is we've been focusing on this last segment, and it's looking quite good. The last 2 months have been increases, and it's looking quite good. We do have increases for people without disabilities, so relatively speaking, both seem to be recovering. You see the long recovery. In economic terms, it's not actually considered a recovery until employment goes above, actually, recovery is in terms of GDP, technically, but an indicator hasn't recovered until it reaches its prior peak. So it's hard to tell with these data because we don't have those extra years in the beginning. But we're focusing, on the good news of this past few months, 2017 and to the end of 2016, or most of 2016, are pretty good periods of time. I'm always skeptical of whether to call this positive, but it's certainly better than the other direction. But as always, we want to point out that the gap between people with and without disability is still very substantial, and there's still a lot of work to do. One of the neat things about seeing the employment to population ratio and the employment to population ratio and the labor force participation rate increasing at a rate greater than people without disabilities is that, it continues to describe the narrative that we've been using, that people with disabilities are working, they're striving to work, they're looking for work, and that's a positive. That's a positive thing. Now, that has to be caveated with the employment differences are still pretty substantial. So I'm going to turn it over to Denise. Oh, I had a little extra slide with this little arrow pushed in there. So we're almost to the same level we were back in 2009. So that looks pretty good. Denise will introduce our guest, but Denise from the Association of Universities Centers on Disability, UCD, will give us the news. So I'll turn it over to you, Denise, and advance it to the first slide.
There it is. Thanks, Andrew. So you are looking at, every month we have been updating you on what's going on in federal policy. And the one for this month, and particularly what's going on healthcare. So I just wanted to give a quick update. The Better Care Reconciliation Act, which we talked about last month, is the bill which is the Obamacare repeal and replace bill in the Senate. We originally had expected a vote on that before July 4th. That didn't happen. The Senate is now trying to vote on that before the August recess. A couple of weeks is what we're hearing now. This is important for all of you. I want to remind you because there's a huge cost shift, huge cuts to Medicaid that are in this. It would change Medicaid from an entitlement program to a per capita capped program, meaning that the federal contribution would be capped. So it would cost shift those federal contributions or that money to the states, providers and families who would have to provide that, or states would have, if they aren't going to do that, states would end up having to cut services. And as we all know, and as I'll remind you, the services that are home and community-based services are basically optional services within Medicaid. They are not the required services. So states may well have to reduce or eliminate optional services, which is employment, transportation, respite, personal care, all those other home and community-based services that help people with disabilities be employed. So keep an eye on this. It's important. it will affect the work that we all do. The vote will be happening for all of those of you, and I have people who say to me, Denise, it looks like there are 10 Republicans opposed to this, so it shouldn't pass. There's lots of negotiations going on right now, so just keep an eye on it, because they are still working for a vote and trying to fix it. Nothing we have seen, at least, fixes, quote unquote, fixes the Medicaid cuts. So don't be fooled, and don't give up. Watching it is important. Okay, next slide, Andrew. There. So there are a couple of interesting tools that I found this month that are mostly additions to things that already you may have been aware of. For instance, I know everyone on this call is probably familiar with the LEAD Center. Well, one of the and all of the great data points that they provide by state. They provide population and number and percentage of people with and without disabilities who are employed, and outcomes for SSA and VR and mental health, all kinds of good data. The newest thing they have added is VR data, and specifically VR rates by state for services and their payment structures and policies around VR rate setting. So this is something that allows you to compare payments for rates within the state, as well as compare rates state to state on a variety of VR services. I think this is a huge, and of course I'm a state government relations person. That's what I live and breathe. So for people who are looking at states and what's going on in your states, and particularly some of the changes that have to happen by states under WIOA, this is a great tool, and I really recommend it to you. Next slide, Andrew. Another one, again, we've talked a little bit about Work Matters. Work Matters there was a task force, National Task Force on Workforce Development for People with Disabilities, that was formed through a grant with ODEP and the National Conference of State Legislatures, Women in Government, Council of State Governments, all worked together, and they came out with a great report maybe 2 years ago around these kinds of policies for people with disabilities, and worked with there's a great report on the National Governors Association, all kinds of work. What they have now added to the website is you can again click state by state and find policies and programs by state and state legislation around employment of people with disabilities and workforce development. It is, again, a fabulous site, a great way to be able to see what's going on in your state and what state legislation is happening, a great way to compare it to other states around you on things that are happening, to get good ideas, to look for tools and resources. It's created for policymakers specifically so that they can go in and look at this, but I think it's great for all of us to be able to know what's going on in the states, what's going on in states near you, what great ideas you might come up with to take to those legislators and say, hey, this is what's happening in the state next door. Why can't we be doing this? So that's another one. Next slide. And on that same idea, Kentucky is the first state to actually form a Work Matters task force, and they just created it. Their mission is to look at barriers to employment and promote inclusion within workforce for people with disabilities, foster children, disabled vets, individuals with substance abuse issues, and individuals with criminal records. There's a 23-member task force. They're going to be looking at all areas of state government involved in workforce development and also combined with representatives from the private sector. It's another one of those great ideas that if you want to go to your state government and say, hey, we need to be looking at this too. Here's what somebody else is doing. Can't we do something like this? And it's a great way to help educate folks on what's going on, but also to look at what are those barriers and how can we change those? Can we change those? Next slide. This one is an interesting one that just popped up, and it's just, I'm highlighting it for you. It's supposed to be available later this year for iPhone and for Android early in 2018. It's a mobile workplace accommodation app. It's supposed to help you as businesses create inclusive workplaces, and it allows you, in terms of the accommodations process, to streamline that. It allows both employees with disabilities to be able to streamline their accommodation process, as well as for employers to be able to streamline the accommodation process. It's coming out of West Virginia. It's a NIDLR-funded program. They just demoed it at the in June here in DC at the M-Enabling Summit, and got some good reviews. So I'm putting this out there. Keep an eye open for this one. I think this one's really interesting. And again, it's the kind of cool thing that businesses like. And I think it's a great thing to be able to go in and say, look at this new cool thing that's out and look at what this can do. So it's a great entree into businesses as well. Like I said, it's supposed to be out late this year and for Android early in 2018. Next slide. Before we go, I just want to highlight a couple of things. I always look at, I don't know why the early Android is at the bottom of this slide. You can ignore that. The journal, I just want to highlight, the Journal for Vocational Rehabilitation did their special section in June 2017, the one that just came out on the proceedings of the APSE National Conference in June 2016. So there's all kinds of articles in there around transition and employment and post-secondary apprenticeships, and particularly around transition stuff and supported employment. Obviously, it's the APSE conference. So I'm telling you, absolutely go look at this one. I'm not highlighting anyone in particular. I know you all know the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, but if you haven't seen it, this one's a great one. And last slide from me, Andrew. And I can't let this go, the July go, without saying happy anniversary to the ADA. July 26, 1990, so we are celebrating the 27th anniversary. There are all kinds of things going on around the country. The ADEA Anniversary Toolkit's online. I gave you the link for it. And you can also check in at ada.gov. There's all kinds of resources and monthly themes and StoryCorps, stories you can look at. So I'm absolutely happy anniversary. It's a big deal. And have a good July 26th. Okay, let's move on to our interviewee, Andrew. So, and you can go one more. So I am really excited to have Ben Trockman on, oh, back one, there we go, to have Ben Trockman on as the interviewee today. Ben, I've known Ben for a long time through my work at Easter Seals before I came here. And Ben is a guy with a disability. We always try to have somebody on to talk about what it's really like to be out in the employment world. And so I'm going to see, Ben, are you there?
I'm here.
Terrific. So Ben, would you, why don't you start out, why don't you talk to folks a little bit about your disability? Let's start there.
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, I appreciate you all having me on today, and this is a great privilege to be along with friends and talk about what's going on. I will apologize. I don't have video feed. I work for a bank. And as Andrew pointed out earlier, it is Old National Bank, and so we have not reverted to the new National. So video capability not possible at this point. That's my lighthearted joke for the day. To talk about my disability, so in 2006, I was involved in a motocross accident. So I am paralyzed from the neck down. Been that way for the past 11 years. Presented definitely life a little bit of challenges here and there, but I would say most of all, my disability, as most people would say, does not define the things that I do, but it has definitely made me into who I am today. I've had great relationships with Easter Seals, been able to serve as a national ambassador in 2012, had the opportunity to travel all across the country and really feel the passion of what it means to be in the disability inclusion sector. But, a spinal cord injury is a challenging thing, whether it's just keeping up with daily health or life or finding, you brought up, and this is a very, very sensitive and interesting subject, and we won't go off on a tangent, but I'll just mention it because it's worth noting, is the nurses that take me to work every single day. They are paid for by and reimbursed by Medicaid. So right now, as we promote disability inclusion and promoting workforce opportunities, and companies are starting to realize, that there's this great talent out there. I think it's so important, not only for me as on the employer side, but as a disability advocate, to keep sharing the stories of, these nurses. The therapy sessions that I receive that are covered by Medicaid are so vitally important for, not only people like myself, but the entire country, to keep us healthy, happy, and honestly just participating in society. So there's my side note for the day.
That was awesome. Ben, why don't you talk a little bit about your job history, kind of barriers to employment, and then what you're doing now?
Sure, absolutely. And so just a brief synopsis. I say brief synopsis, but anybody that knows me is familiar that brief is not a word that describes anything that I do on a day-to-day basis. But so I've been with Old National for about 3 years now. My position is as a community outreach and employment specialist. So it's an interesting story that I'll keep short, is that when I graduated college, I wasn't really exactly sure what I was going to do with my life. I graduated with a degree in PR and advertising from the University of Southern Indiana, which is located right here in Evansville, Indiana, my hometown. And I knew that I was passionate about disability inclusion. My real passion was to get into sports. We don't have a professional sports team. And after I met with folks at Old National Bank to just discuss career options, they quickly realized that they didn't have a sports team either, but they had the passion to create a position to find a way to help improve employment opportunities for people with disabilities within our community and within our footprint. So essentially the mission of my position at Old National, yes, not New National, remember Old National. There's a shout out. We've been established, and we were established in 1834 in Evansville, and have been headquartered here ever since. Okay, that's another side note. There's a little punch there. But my position essentially is to help find ways to promote disability inclusion within our workforce and the communities that we serve. And that's led to the creation of different councils, a program that I'll share with you in a moment that's really helped our leadership, but a lot of partnership with local not-for-profits that do disability employment services, and so much more. But it's been a great ride, and I enjoy the work that I do every single day. Just one last note is I work in HR, which is so strange for me as a person in PR and advertising, and I always speak my mind, and I think, oh my goodness, I hope they're not listening to what I'm saying. So I report directly to our talent acquisition managers. So this is my position at Old National is directed specifically to improving our talent of people with disabilities in our workforce.
Hey, Ben, why don't we, Andrew, would you flip the slide? And Ben, why don't you tell us about the program? I think that's a great time.
Absolutely. So Achievability, as we were trying to early on when I joined the bank, trying to figure out what is our first step to really making a significant impact within our organization. And one of the first things that we led to was, if we're going to have buy-in as a company, and I think it's important for viewers and listeners to know that Old National, we have about 3,000 associates. We're in a 4-state footprint, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and also in Wisconsin. Yeah, we can go back there.
Go back one in.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay.
You trying to throw me off? Is that what it is? I get it.
Well, it's multitasking.
Yeah, you'll have that. So throughout our trying to create a culture of change and a culture of inclusion throughout a 4-state footprint, what could we do? So we knew that we needed to have the buy-in of our leadership and the understanding of our leadership. So we created the Achievability Professional Mentoring Program. And you can see in this picture here a few of the participants Well, so there's my handsome picture on the very bottom right. In the blue, of course. If you guys didn't know, there's like sparklies around me, little sizzles of hotness, that kind of thing. Yeah, there you go.
Keep going. Keep going.
So yeah, right. So in the picture is a group of our executive leaders. In the center with glasses is our CEO, Bob Jones. And so what we've asked is that our 23 executive leaders throughout our 4-state footprint, who are in charge of different lines of business, we're pairing them with mentees. The mentees are individuals that we recruit from local university disability services offices through our relationships with those folks, and also our disability employment not-for-profit providers, job coaches, etc. If they find a student, a person who could benefit from a mentoring relationship, but also is open and willing to sharing a little bit about their life story, as we're doing today, we pair them with our executive leader. So throughout a year and a half or 2 years almost through this program, we've had 18 pairings. We've hired 4 individuals out of this program. We've had about 3 of the individuals be referred to other employers. The 2 things that I think are most important is the mentees that participate are getting a chance to learn from a leader in the community. They're getting a chance to have face-to-face interaction with folks. Secondly, and what's selfishly important for us as an institution, as a company, as an employer, we are having people with spinal cord injuries, people with hearing impairments, who are deaf, who are blind, who are spina bifida, cerebral palsy, participating in this program, that are exposing our leadership to people of all abilities, and they're learning the barriers that we overcome every single day to be successful in life. And that's leading to so many great experiences, and for us to be able to overcome those mental barriers and assumptions that we all as employers make about employees with disabilities, that many times keep individuals out of the workforce. We're overcoming those things by these great, casual, fun, interactive experiences.
Thanks. That's fabulous, Ben. So lastly, I know I'm running out of time here. So lastly, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Assuming you're not a professional sportscaster, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
You know, I would not want to be anywhere else than Old National Bank, continuing the work that we do. We have so much work to do. You know, we've created a great tone at the top. It's starting to filter out throughout our 4-state footprint. Andrew, if you flip slides for me. Just one last note. I think this is important, thinking about the future. And this is a call to action. Our Abilities First Associate Resource Group at Old National has embraced the Change the Sign momentum. You can visit changethesign.com, and as you can see on the bottom right, you know, I know probably a lot of people that are familiar with the new updated logo. We're promoting it in Indiana and Wisconsin. But the reason I bring that up to your question of 5 years from now is through legislation, through people, through interactions, we have a lot of work to do. And with partnerships with great folks like you, I think we make a significant impact. So I appreciate the time, sharing a little bit of our story, and I hope that anyone on this call, this webinar, will feel free to reach out to me. We have a lot to share, but a lot to learn from others as well.
Thanks so much, Ben. I really appreciate it. And
yeah, thank you.
Back to Andrew.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Denise. So I'm going to turn it over to Wendy. Wendy's from South Dakota, and she is at the Center for Disabilities at the University of South Dakota. I'll quickly just turn it over to Wendy. Wendy, take it over.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, perfect. Well, hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you, Ben. That was really exciting information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working with vocational rehabilitation. And as many of you know, my background is in rehabilitation counseling and special education. So my whole career has kind of navigated both of those systems, and how confusing and difficult at times that can sometimes be. So I don't profess to have all the answers, but maybe have some ideas and suggestions that could be helpful to folks out there. Can you move to, there we go. So when we think about employment first, you know, we're seeing the changes in the outcome data, and you know, we're seeing such momentum across the country, and it's very exciting that employment is becoming the first option given to folks. And when we think about that, it shifts the whole question to what does this person want to do, instead of can this individual go to work? And this has been legislatively allowed in, can you go back again?
We're on one of those automatic timers.
Okay, sorry. In vocational rehabilitation, but with employment first, we're really starting to see some changes, and but this is turning systems upside down. And so with vocational rehabilitation operating at the local level with the different counselors and within the state, we can see a great deal of variation across what is actually happening in practice. Okay, so next slide. So, you know, thinking about getting started, one of the biggest challenges I see out there is the referral process. And that often is the case of people being referred to vocational rehabilitation. We've all had some bad experiences. We've all seen people denied by vocational rehabilitation. And I think oftentimes as a result of that, we don't even think to make the referral. But this is an exciting time. There's great change. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to revisit that and make the referrals to the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency. And whoops, I didn't realize it was on a timer, so okay. And so also too, one of the challenges I hear from the providers all the time is that the referrals from vocational rehabilitation have very little information. They just provide the barriers. And so you have to kind of start all over again and working with someone. And so having that communication and maybe enhancing that process can be a very helpful beginning. Okay, next slide. So what are some things that we can do as we're moving employment first forward? I think one thing that's really helpful is to look at developing relationships with your counselor. Look at what each other's role is. And I think it's surprising sometimes when we actually sit down and talk and have that shared space to just understand what the other person's requirements are, what they're accountable for, and how can we help each other out. Oftentimes, many of the things are very similar, and rather than duplicating, can actually enhance those resources and the expertise that each person has. And I think one of the biggest things that we need to remember is being flexible and being creative. As we're moving and more people are entering into employment, we really are, a lot of people are learning and developing those skills, and we can work together, but we have to take those ideas and try, maybe just one person at a time, of bending the rules a little bit to see what works best and how you can provide the services that allow you as a provider and the rehab counselor to meet their requirements and what they need to do. So being flexible and creative, and also don't ever forget data. That's a really important part of this whole process in making your point. Okay, next slide. So as we're moving employment first forward, one of the, a couple of the key pieces that as providers and job coaches that we're thinking about is moving from readiness to assessment and discovery. This is a time where we really need to spend time with people, getting to know them, conducting real work assessments in the community with situational assessments, where people can have the chance to see what kinds of jobs and work cultures work best for them, and also just having more time to spend together. But oftentimes the way that authorization and funding occurs, it's prohibitive for the job coach to do that. And so they get a referral and then they have to run out and try and find a job because of the time constraints. And so I think really trying to negotiate, this is an option that vocational rehabilitation can authorize a service modality for conducting situational assessments, and can pay for that as an option. And then it provides you as the provider more time to be able to spend. And you know, interestingly, one job coach I was just working with not long ago went from a person who was referred to doing this additional situational assessment and discovery time with vocational rehabilitation, authorizing it. And when they finished, they said, you know, I've seen this person every day in the day services for many, many years, and I never knew who this person really was until I was out there spending time with them. And you know, they really saw that individual very differently as an employee, and were able to find a better job match. So by doing these situational assessments and writing the information up and sharing it with Voc Rehab can be helpful for them in authorizing it in the future. Okay, next slide. Another direction is moving from job openings to job match. So we need to develop business relationships, spend time visiting job sites, and really looking at what the requirements are and what the employer's needs are, and that takes time. And so one of the things that I often hear is that it's the amount of money, but it's also the reimbursement process itself, the time frame, so that many providers get a payment at referral, but then they don't get another payment until placement. So these are things that would be really helpful as a provider to have a conversation with your rehab counselor if these are challenges that you have, and see where the flexibility can be in payment. Can things be adjusted so that you have that opportunity to spend the additional time that's needed and to be able to be reimbursed at a timely way that allows your program to continue to operate. And the more that you can share that information with the rehab counselor, what I hear from them often is, if it's documented, if you provide the information of how much time you need and what it's being used for, and the different providers, businesses that you're contacting, that can be really helpful to keep them in the loop. Okay, next one. And then as we moved with Employer First to placement, finding a job, and then training and supporting that person on the job, there's going to be some areas that that need support, training, accommodations, and your recommendations are really helpful to the rehab counselor. And I oftentimes will hear that, well, we have to wait until they're not successful and then rehab will pay. Let's try and shift that. So on the very front end, if you're thinking that somebody needs assistive technology or other kinds of accommodations, make that, can you go back one? Make that suggestion, be proactive, mention how many hours you think you're going to need and how much time on the job site, and keep the rehab counselor in the loop, making sure that you're collecting data, documenting why you're having to be on the job site and how much more time you may need. Often I hear that, well, Voc Rehab will only authorize 20 hours. And we know that many people are going to need a lot more time than that. And so keeping that communication open, and I can't stress enough how sharing data can be so helpful in influencing the amount of time that can be authorized. Okay. Next slide. Oh, and one example that, just to show there can be such variation across localities, I just did a training, and one of the, several of the people in there said, well, Voc Rehab won't buy the assistive technology, my counselor won't do it. And one person in there, same state, said, well, my counselor, all I have to do is call up and say, I need this, and they authorize it right away. And so as people were talking about that, it seemed like having that personal relationship was one of the things that was so helpful in allowing that person to access the technology they needed. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to highlight a few things from South Dakota, some very specific strategies that might be helpful. So in South Dakota, we have a high employment rate of 51%, but that still means that we have 49% of the people not working. And as the providers are moving and to serve more and more individuals who have high support needs. And so Voc Rehab has initiated many things that we're finding is having a huge impact on the outcomes and the services out there. Whoops. Okay, so one, they're funding capacity building grants so that providers are receiving money up front to hire job coaches that gradually start reducing the amount of money the provider has over time. So year 2, they get a little bit less, and year 3. So this person can start working with individuals who are in their day programs and workshops, and the provider has a chance to gradually absorb their salary. They're also really focusing on certification, the APSE, Certified Employment Support Professional certification credential. And so Voc Rehab is paying for people to take the test, and those individuals who receive their CESP receive a 25% higher reimbursement rate to the provider, which is having a very large impact on the outcomes that the providers are reporting. The state is also invested into trainings, which I am doing at my Center for Disabilities, and we provide both basic overview as well as very advanced hands-on training so that people come together. And one of the things that's valued the most is that chance to be able to network and share ideas like, well, we got this in our community and our rehab counselor is doing this. And then people are able to go back and use those real examples. There's big emphasis in the state to be person-centered. So the very first meeting, that's at the very top of the form, it's talking about the employment and what the person wants to do. Another big influence has been the paid work experiences that vocational rehabilitation is doing in conjunction with school systems, so that Voc Rehab pays the wages and the school puts the job coach up for 240 hours a year. Then now they're also doing an employment skills with the adult providers, same kind of situation, which has been a really helpful way for people to get some work skills that have been in day programs and sheltered workshop settings. And so it's a chance for them to be out there, and oftentimes they turn into employment or they provide some additional information to find a job. They also are conducting networking for monthly networking meetings in each region for the different providers to share. And we also hold a monthly phone call for them. And then business connections, they have business resource networks in a couple areas of the state, as well as a business liaison person. Okay, next one, last slide. So another strategy that we found to be really helpful is here at the center, we conduct a transition and action clinic, and it's a day-long event. It's focused on the person's future, and right now it's serving transition age youth that are 16 to 21, and it's for those individuals who all have not had employment, really as the forefront. And so we're integrating health, education, and employment and independent living through this day-long event that includes benefits planning and a self-advocate peer mentor and a parent rep and all the different agencies. But one of the participants is the vocational rehabilitation counselor. Not for this individual. People come from all over and participate in this clinic. But what has been really helpful is that we do situational assessments and a lot of other things. And it's writing that report and the recommendations and strategies and sharing that information that we're finding is really helpful. And Voc Rehab is, nobody's getting reimbursed for it, and what they're saying is this is really helpful to us and something that we should be doing, being out into the community. So it's one way perhaps to maybe engage the counselor in your location, or something similar to this. So that's the last slide. So so I hope some of these things can be helpful. I think in summary, the more that we can sit down and have conversations, open up, to clarify what people are doing, to try and offer to help each other and share your creative and new ideas with each other, and see how you can make them happen, I think can contribute, and most importantly to not forget sharing data and keeping the counselor in the loop can oftentimes lead to more and more opportunities for you as the provider. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. We're going to jump right into the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes. We have still 60 or so participants on. And what I'll do is I'll probably start with a question for you, Wendy, while we give people time to kind of prep their questions. So, boy, I have a lot of questions. So, you know, it's really neat to hear your talk from the perspective of all the areas that a voc rehab specialist or counselor or, you know, any kind of voc rehab provider, all the various things that they have to be capable of doing. It's quite a, when I was hearing this, I was thinking of it in the pantheon of rehab, you know, of med rehab, where once you're in med rehab, you go to OT, PT, and speech, right? And there's never a referral to vocational rehabilitation, right? And it's not cued in on that medical model, which people with an injury will be introduced to. And the same may go for schools. They might do a better job working with schools and teachers from the OT, PT, and speech world. But it's almost like you're collapsing all of, what if we expected OT, PT, and speech to do one thing, you know, all in one person?
Right.
You know, you're talking about working with employers, working with other community, other agencies, you know, because you have Child Protective Service, you have all these different agencies involved.
Right.
And it's really a phenomenal capacity that has to be held, a diverse capacity that has to be held. I don't know if there was ever a question in that rambling, but perhaps you can talk about the breadth, the capacity that a person may have.
You know, I think you're so right, Andrew, that oftentimes we just think of voc rehab as the pocketbook, you know, as a referral, and we think, you know, how frustrating it is, and I know it can be. You know, I've had the same experiences, I'm sure, as all of you, as a job coach for many years. But I think if we can understand the complexity of their role, but also the value that they can bring. I have found when I sit down with the rehab counselor and share, you know, I have this problem, and, you know, this is a situation, or, you know, I have an idea, how open they can be, and truly a contributing member to that team. And so sometimes we can just broaden their role and their capacity, and I do think it all starts with relationships. So.
Okay. Are there any other questions out there? Any of the panelists have a question for Wendy or for
So
Ben?
if you don't mind, if I just pipe in, this has been speaking for a moment, Wendy. I really appreciate your comments. I think as someone working in the employment world on the employer side, one of the things that we struggle with significantly is finding the providers and the job coaches that want to understand our positions, want to understand our needs as an employer. You know, for so long it's been, hey, we have a great candidate with a disability, don't you want to hire them? And now it's not that time. We need providers that understand the needs of our businesses and our communities, that understand our jobs, and are willing to take a little time to understand, okay, well, when I meet with Denise, I know that she has, you know, great communication skills. Maybe she's not great at keying certain information, so that we know when we're introduced to a client that, okay, well, this person would fit really great at our call center, or this person would fit really great wherever. So I appreciate just the comments and the perspective, because I think that's something like I said, that we struggle with finding, but I think that providers are starting to learn more, especially as we tell them that's what we need. So maybe we're forcing them into it, but such an important direction for us to be successful in the future.
Oh, Ben, you are so correct. And you know, I think there's so many challenges out there as systems with the skill sets. And when you think about the rehabilitation counselors, they may have 10 job coaches who are great and 5 who aren't as good. And so, you know, they also are compounded with a lot of variation in there too. But I think so often that the job coaches kind of need that permission to do the things that you described that are so important. And so that feedback is really helpful, I think, to them. And hopefully they take it back to the rehab counselor and they change how they get funded and the time they can spend on things.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that comment reminds me of, you know, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles was never updated. ONET, you know, trying to describe a job, you know, it's one thing, you know, so I grew up in a small town, actually in New Jersey, and, you know, social services was very handcrafted, very person-centered. You know, my mother used to actually manage the bank accounts of several people in the town who couldn't manage their bank accounts effectively. And, you know, it's just a different world when you put volume, a place like New York City where there's millions and the volume. And you want to be able to characterize jobs and the needs of an employer, but jobs are just so much more complex, and keeping up with it is keeping up with those personal relationships and understanding the occupational requirements of a job is just, it's a big task, and it's hard to do with data. If you look at ONET, it's still not detailed enough. You know, we do have a particular question to Wendy from Bart Devon. Is there a particular set of interventions you think might help people with developmental disabilities find work, especially if they're nonverbal? So policy interventions.
Well, are you talking about state level policy?
It's not clear from the comment, but sure, state and federal.
Okay. So, you know, one thing, by living in multiple states like I have, and I've seen employment first legislation, and the practice was not as effective in turning into outcomes. But then I'm in a state now where there is no employment first policy, yet we're having a very positive, like, grassroots level emphasis. We have a governor who supports employment, and the agencies follow suit. So we have had really good luck by doing it more through conversations, key stakeholders getting together and deciding what needs to be done, people listening to each other and making it happen. So, but I do know a lot of examples of other states where employment first policy is really driving the way the different states are operating and the services and the outcomes that they're achieving. Does that get to what you're thinking about, the question?
Well, if he texts us back or uses the chat function back, we can do that. A couple questions. Yes, we do send out the slides to Susan. If you email me, I can make sure you definitely get the data. If you're just interested in the data, underlying data, I can clean up an Excel spreadsheet and send it out to you. To Greg Beatty, we don't have, separation rates are difficult. Yes and no. The current population survey does have has been used to do ascension and separation rates and ascension rates. So people separating from work and people ascending into work, and they're by disability type would be hard because the samples will be pretty small. Targeted disability is a specific term used that's not used there's nothing on the specific targeted disabilities that are part of the federal government. Let's see, there are several other questions. They all seem to come in a wave. Let's see. I think that's about it. There's lots of people saying thank you very much to Wendy and to Ben and Denise and I and John. We're right at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to call it a day. If you're Wendy, thank you very much. Ben, thank you very much. This was a very employment-centered, as appropriately so, talk. And it's great to hear the perspective of the states and perspective of vocational rehabilitation and the banking industry, a great industry that has a lot to offer. So thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next month on the first Friday. I think that's the 4th of August. So, all right, thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.